Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who joins us from around the world. We're so glad you're here.
It's really great to be back.
This is Andrew and Renee. Welcome to the Stack series.
I'm really looking forward to getting into this one today.
Today, we are exploring DNA data storage. And honestly, I have to admit, when I first saw this topic on our schedule, my brain just went straight to those old sci-fi movies. I'm picturing a mosquito trapped in amber holding the source code for Windows 95 instead of dinosaur blood.
Well, that's actually it's a surprisingly accurate mental image to start with, though hopefully we're preserving something a bit more critical than Windows 95 for the future. But the amber analogy, that's incredibly spot on.
It just sounds like pure science fiction, right? The idea that we can take a digital file like a movie or a photo or a massive database and just turn it into a biological molecule. But as I started reading through the stack of research we have for today's exploration, I realized this isn't just happening in novels anymore. It's happening right now in labs and startups from Boston to Paris.
It certainly feels very futuristic, but in many ways it's really about returning to the oldest, most optimized storage system on the planet. I mean, nature has been storing data for billions of years. It has withstood cataclysms, ice ages, intense radiation. We are just now figuring out how to, borrow that technology for our own digital lives.
Exactly. But before we get into the wet lab stuff, the beakers and the double helixes, I think we need to set the scene for you listening at home. We need to talk about the data sphere. Because, frankly, looking at the numbers in these reports, we humans are hoarding digital stuff at a rate that is, frankly, terrifying.
It's an absolute explosion. We are generating zettabytes of data annually. And to put a zettabyte in perspective, that is a 1 followed by 21 zeros.
Yeah, my brain just completely fails to visualize that.
Right, so think of it this way. If you tried to store the current global datasphere on standard DVDs, the stack would reach past the moon. And we're creating this amount every single year, with the rate increasing exponentially. Every photo you take, every email you send, every sensor reading from an autonomous vehicle on the highway, every scientific data set, it all just piles up.
And here's the kicker. And this is something I struggle with personally. We are running out of physical room. I actually have a drawer in my desk at home that is just a graveyard of external hard drives, you know the type, the bulky black boxes with the little blinking blue lights.
Oh, I am very familiar with the graveyard.
And half of them don't even work anymore. I tried to plug one in last week to find some old college photos, and it just made this sad click noise, the dreaded click of death. And that brings us perfectly to the problem with our current tech. Silicon chips, magnetic tapes, hard drives, they're all hitting a hard physical limit.
Precisely. We are facing a storage crisis on two entirely different fronts: density and durability. When people talk about the cloud, they imagine this magical, weightless vapor. But the cloud is actually massive, sprawling warehouses filled with spinning disks and servers, and they consume unbelievable amounts of electricity just to keep that data alive and cool.
I read a stat in one of the articles that said if we keep generating data at this pace and we just rely on silicon, we'd eventually need to cover the entire surface of the planet in data centers just to store our cat videos and spreadsheets.
Which is only a slight exaggeration, honestly. But the durability issue is perhaps even more pressing. You mentioned your dead hard drive. Magnetic tape, which is still the absolute gold standard for archiving banking records and government data, it degrades. It suffers from something called bit rot.
Bit rot? That sounds like a terrible disease.
In a way it is. It's just entropy. Over time, the magnetic domains on a tape or a disk can spontaneously flip, so a 0 becomes a 1, and suddenly your file is completely corrupted. You have to migrate that data to new tapes every 10 to 30 years, or you lose it forever. It's this endless, incredibly expensive treadmill of copying data just to keep it from vanishing.
Which brings us to the biological solution. The idea that instead of building bigger and bigger server farms or trying to invent a slightly better magnet, we should look at the molecule that encodes life itself, DNA.
That is the core premise. DNA is incredibly dense. It doesn't require electricity to maintain its integrity once it's synthesized, and it has lasted in fossils for hundreds of thousands of years. It really is the ultimate cold storage.
So our mission today is to unpack this completely for you. We aren't just going to skim the surface. We're going to look at how you actually turn a digital file into a biological molecule, the actual nuts and bolts of the process. We're going to look at the active debate in the industry, the big war between chemical and enzymatic synthesis, and then we'll look at some truly mind-bending frontiers involving electronic DNA and metabolic soups.
It is such a fascinating landscape. Let's start with the foundations. What do we actually think we know about this?
Right. So part one, foundations. the core concept of nature's hard drive. Now, I think most of us know that computers speak in binary zeros and ones.
Correct. The base 2 system, everything digital you interact with is ultimately just a switch that is either on or off.
And DNA speaks in, well, letters.
Base 4. DNA is a polymer composed of 4 nitrogenous bases: adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. We generally just know them as A, C, G, and T. These bases string together along a sugar phosphate backbone to create that famous double helix shape. So the fundamental trick of DNA data storage is mapping that binary computer code to this quaternary biological code.
Okay, so let's walk through this with a really practical example. Let's say I have a digital photo of my dog, Barnaby.
Yeah.
To my laptop, Barnaby is just a long string of millions of zeros and ones. How do I get Barnaby out of my computer and into a test tube?
You need a translator. We call this the encoding algorithm. In a very simple generic example, let's keep it fairly basic for now. You might say that the binary sequence 00 equals A, 01 equals C, 10 equals G, and 11 equals T.
Okay, so I take the binary string for Barnaby, break it into little 2-bit chunks, and just swap them for the corresponding letters.
Exactly. So if the very first part of your file is 00111001, your DNA sequence simply becomes ATGC. You just do this for the entire file.
And once you do that, the density statistics are just, they honestly break my brain a little bit. I was looking at the comparison charts in the source material we pulled, and the difference between a high-end hard drive and DNA is like comparing a bicycle to a warp drive.
The numbers are absolutely staggering. The theoretical limit for DNA storage is somewhere around 215 petabytes per single gram of DNA.
215 petabytes.
Oh.
In 1 gram, I mean, a paperclip weighs a gram. A raisin weighs a gram.
To visualize it better, consider this. The entire world's data, everything on the internet, every server, every hard drive, everywhere, could theoretically fit inside a shipping container. Or, if we optimize the formatting perfectly to the absolute theoretical limit, perhaps even a standard semi-trailer. Some of the more aggressive estimates suggest you could fit the equivalent of the current internet into a shoebox.
That is just wild. I mean, think about the data centers currently taking up hundreds of acres of land, consuming megawatt hours of power. And you're telling me we could replace all of that concrete and steel with a few boxes of white powder?
In terms of raw volume, yes. That is the promise of molecular density. Molecules are simply much, much smaller than the physical magnetic grains on a hard drive platter.
And unlike that dead hard drive I have sitting in my drawer, this stuff actually lasts.
Durability is the second major advantage here. We have successfully recovered DNA from mammoth bones and ancient horses that is hundreds of thousands of years old. And keep in mind, that DNA wasn't even stored in a secure, climate-controlled vault. It was just lying in the ground, buried in the permafrost.
It survived nature itself.
Exactly. DNA is an incredibly chemically stable molecule. The bonds holding that sugar phosphate backbone together are extremely strong. If you keep DNA cool and dry, effectively fossilized, it can last for millennia without any power source whatsoever. You never need to plug it in. You don't need to check on it. It just sits there, completely inert.
So we have the core concept down. Huge density, huge durability. But how do we actually do it? I think this is where people get really confused. They imagine we are injecting a USB drive into a mouse or something.
No mice involved, I promise. This is a really important point to clarify. This is all in vitro. It happens inside a machine, not inside a living body. The workflow follows a cycle we generally refer to as write, store, read.
Okay, let's break that down step by step for the listeners. Step 1 is encoding, which we just touched on. That's the math part, turning bits into bases on a computer screen. But step 2 is where it gets physically real. Synthesis, the write phase.
Right. This is where we actually create the physical molecule from scratch. We have the string of letters, the ATGC sequence, sitting on the computer monitor. Now we need to physically build a biological molecule that perfectly matches that exact sequence.
So we have machines like huge specialized inkjet printers that just squirt out these custom strands of DNA.
Essentially, yes. But they are incredibly, incredibly precise. Companies like Twist Bioscience or DNA Script use advanced silicon chips to do this. Imagine a standard silicon chip, roughly the size of a postage stamp, but instead of electrical circuits, it has thousands of tiny little microwalls, just microscopic holes.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Inside every single one of those thousands of holes, they are growing a completely different strand of DNA simultaneously. It acts like a microscopic chemical assembly line. They wash the entire chip with a liquid solution containing the A base. The A sticks only where it's supposed to stick based on the light or electrical signals in that well. Then they wash it away and flood the chip with C. Then G. They build the strands layer by layer, letter by individual letter.
It's basically 3D printing, but on a molecular level.
That is a very fair analogy. Once all the strands are built to the right length, they're chemically washed off the chip. Now you have a tiny liquid drop containing billions of these synthetic DNA strands, and that brings us directly to step 3, storage.
Now, liquid is okay, but liquid evaporates. If we want this data to last for 500 years, we obviously can't just leave it in a test tube sitting on a desk.
Correct. For true long-term preservation, you absolutely need to remove the water. The most common way is to lyophilize it,
Which is just a fancy scientific word for
freeze drying. It's the exact same fundamental technology used to make astronaut ice cream or to preserve those little strawberries you get in breakfast cereal. You essentially suck out all the moisture under a deep vacuum. The liquid DNA turns into a tiny, solid pellet, usually white or maybe slightly pinkish in color.
And that dry pellet is perfectly stable.
Incredibly stable, but to be completely safe, you really want to protect it from atmospheric oxygen and moisture. So companies like Imogene take that dried DNA and store it inside tiny stainless steel capsules that are laser welded completely shut. They usually pump in an inert gas like helium or argon before sealing it. There is also some really fascinating research going on right now into embedding the DNA directly into silica spheres, which are basically microscopic glass beads.
It's artificial amber.
Exactly. We are intentionally mimicking the exact way fossils are naturally preserved in rock or amber. If you seal DNA tightly inside glass, it is completely protected from humidity, from oxidation, and even from background radiation.
And finally, that brings us to step 4, sequencing, the read phase. Because eventually I want my picture of Barnaby back.
When you want your data back, you take that steel capsule, you physically crack it open, and you rehydrate the DNA pellet. You just add water. Then you run that liquid through a standard sequencer.
And these are the exact same machines used in hospitals to check for genetic diseases, right?
The very same ones. Companies like Illumina or Oxford Nanopore manufacture these machines. An Illumina machine works optically. It essentially takes millions of high-resolution pictures of the DNA as it adds little fluorescent chemical tags to each letter. An Oxford Nanopore machine operates differently. It physically pulls the long DNA strand through a tiny, tiny microscopic hole, a nanopore, and it precisely measures the disruption in the electrical current as each specific letter passes through.
Like an old-school ticker tape.
Yes. The machine reads the physical sequence, A, T, G, C, and sends that as a standard text file back to a computer. The computer looks at the code, runs the algorithm in reverse to translate those letters back into zeros and ones, and voila! The photo of Barnaby appears on your screen.
And what's amazing to me is that we've actually done this. This isn't just a whiteboard theory. I was reading through some of the cool real-world examples in the research logs we gathered.
Oh, absolutely. Microsoft and the University of Washington have been huge pioneers here. They successfully stored the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in over 100 different languages. They stored a high-definition music video by the rock band OK Go.
Oh, I love that video. The one with all the umbrellas and the complex choreography.
Hey, that's the one. They even stored a classic movie, Le Voyage dans la Lune, A Trip to the Moon, the famous silent film from 1902. And perhaps most impressively, from a technical standpoint, they have stored entire complex operating systems and massive, sprawling databases of seeds from the Svalbard Global Seed Vault.
And there's that machine called Shannon from the company catalog. I saw a picture of this thing in the source files. It doesn't look like a delicate lab instrument at all. It looks like a massive factory robot.
Yes, named after Claude Shannon, the brilliant father of information theory. It is about the size of a family kitchen. It uses heavily modified commercial inkjet printer technology to physically deposit the DNA. It's a huge step in moving this from a slow benchtop science experiment to a true industrial process. They are printing DNA at speeds that were completely unimaginable just a few years ago.
So that is the foundation. We can do it. It works. It's dense, and it lasts effectively forever. But, and there is always a big but, why don't I have a DNA drive inside my laptop right now? Why isn't Apple selling the iDNA?
That brings us perfectly to part 2, active debate, the hurdles, and the biggest one, by far, is the cost.
I saw a figure in one of the sources we pulled, some comments on a technical article, citing something like $1,100 per kilobyte.
The estimates do vary wildly depending on the specific synthesis method and the scale, but yes, it is currently astronomically expensive compared to a standard hard drive or magnetic tape. $1,100 per kilobyte is a massive barrier that keeps this strictly in the realm of high-value archival data for the time being.
So if I wanted to store a standard 1 GB movie, that would cost millions.
Currently, yes, millions of dollars. The physical reagents, the highly purified chemicals used to make the DNA, they are expensive. The silicon microchips are expensive.
So I am definitely not putting my holiday photos on DNA anytime soon.
Not unless you are an eccentric billionaire who really, really values those specific vacation photos. But costs are dropping steadily. The entire industry is banking on a trajectory similar to Moore's law, which saw the cost of silicon transistors completely crash over a few decades. In biology, they sometimes call it the Carlson curve for DNA synthesis and sequencing.
The other big issue I saw is speed. You outlined the write, store, read process, but how fast is the writing part, really?
Painfully slow. Writing DNA, the actual synthesis, is the major physical bottleneck. We are talking about speeds of bits per second or maybe kilobits per second. Your standard silicon memory operates at gigabits per second. Reading the DNA is a lot faster, largely thanks to the massive genomics revolution over the last 20 years, but writing involves actual physical chemical reactions. You have to wait for molecules to physically bond to one another. You can't just flip an electrical switch at the speed of light.
So the active debate in the field right now is basically, is this just for cold storage? Like, is this only for the deep archives you write once, maybe never ever read, or maybe read 50 years from now?
Most experts currently agree that is the immediate sweet spot. Ideally, it's a write once, read never model, or read rarely. It is perfect for the National Archives, the raw master recordings of movies, critical historical legal records, or things like nuclear waste repository warnings. It is absolutely not for hot storage like the RAM in your computer, where you need instant millisecond access just to open a web browser.
Let's talk a bit more about how they actually make the DNA, because there is a really interesting technical battle going on there too. Chemical versus enzymatic synthesis. This really seems to be the VHS versus Betamax war of the DNA world right now.
This is a really crucial distinction to understand. The traditional way we have made synthetic DNA for decades, the way Twist and all the older companies started, is called phosphoramidite synthesis. It's a purely chemical process. It is very reliable. We know exactly how to do it at scale.
Oh, there's a catch.
A big one. It uses incredibly harsh chemicals, solvents like acetonitrile, trichloroacetic acid. It produces a lot of toxic liquid byproducts that have to be disposed of very carefully as hazardous waste. And it has a strict physical length limit. As you build the strand letter by letter, chemical errors naturally accumulate. The overall yield drops. You can really only make strands that are maybe 200 bases long before the quality just falls off a cliff.
So it's kind of like trying to build a really, really tall tower out of slightly shaky blocks. Eventually, no matter how careful you are, it just falls over.
Yeah, exactly. So to store a big file, you have to stitch millions of these very short strands together computationally, which adds a huge amount of overhead and complexity. Enter enzymatic synthesis. This is the new challenger. Companies like DNA Script are using biological enzymes, specifically one called TDT, to build the DNA instead of harsh chemicals.
TTT. And this is closer to how nature actually does it, right? Because our human bodies use enzymes to build DNA all the time.
Nature uses enzymes constantly, yes. But TDT, which stands for terminal deoxynucleotide transferase, is a very special enzyme. Most enzymes in your body, like regular polymerases, are just copiers. They look at an existing template strand of DNA and they just duplicate it. TDT is entirely different. It is a writer. It can actually add new free-floating bases to a strand without needing a template to copy from. It can just type out whatever letter you feed it.
And the practical advantages of using enzymes instead of chemicals.
It is entirely water-based. It happens in an aqueous solution at normal temperatures, exactly like it does inside a living cell. So it is a much greener technology.
Right.
No highly toxic solvents to dispose of. And potentially, because biological enzymes have evolved to be so incredibly precise, it can make much, much longer strands. We are talking thousands of bases long instead of 200. This drastically helps with data density and decoding. It's still in the process of scaling up commercially, but it is widely seen as the inevitable future of the entire field.
Now, you mentioned errors a second ago, and this is something that really stood out to me as I was prepping for this. We generally think of computers as mathematically perfect. A 0 is a 0. But DNA synthesis isn't perfect. It actually has typos.
It absolutely does. When you synthesize millions and billions of microscopic strands in parallel, sometimes the chemical machine simply misses a letter. We call that a deletion error. Sometimes it accidentally adds an extra letter, which is an insertion error.
And the readers, the sequencing machines, they have their own completely separate problems too. I read quite a bit about these things called homopolymers. Can you explain that for the listeners?
Sure. A homopolymer is simply a repeating sequence of the exact same letter in a row, like A.
Right.
Certain reading technologies, especially nanopore sequencing, really struggle with this. Imagine you are slowly pulling a piece of knotted string through your fingers with your eyes completely closed. If the string has distinct knots in it, you can easily feel each one as it passes. But if you hit a long, perfectly smooth section of the string representing 5 A's in a row, the electrical signal the machine reads looks completely flat. It is very hard for the sensor to tell if that smooth section was 5 A's long or 6 A's long just by measuring the duration of the flat signal.
Oh, I see. It's like hearing a long, continuous beep on an answering machine. You don't know just by listening if that beep lasted exactly 5.1 seconds or 5.2 seconds unless you have a precision stopwatch, and even then, there's a margin of error.
Exactly. It blurs together. So, how do we fix this inherent biological messiness? We use advanced algorithms. We actually borrow heavily from the math developed for early telecommunications and aerospace.
The Reed-Solomon codes.
Yes. This is the exact same brilliant math that allows your badly scratched CD to still play music perfectly, or allows a QR code to still scan on your phone even if a quarter of it is covered up by a sticker or dirt. You intentionally add redundancy into the code.
Logical redundancy, not just making physical copies.
Right. You don't just write the raw data sequence, you write the data plus extra mathematical parity bits woven throughout. These are basically mathematical clues that allow the decoding software to completely reconstruct the missing or incorrect pieces later. If the math doesn't perfectly add up when you read it back at the end, the computer knows, oh, wait, based on the parity bits, that A should have definitely been a T, and it automatically fixes it before you ever see the file.
There was also a really dense mention of something called spatial encoding in one of the journal articles. This seemed incredibly clever to me.
Yes, this was from a very recent fascinating paper on lossless compression techniques for biological storage. Instead of just looking at the DNA as a single linear flat sequence of letters, they map the data to a two-dimensional spatial domain, kind of like a grid or a matrix.
Like a Sudoku puzzle. That's what came to mind when I read it.
That is a brilliant analogy, actually. Yes, in Sudoku, if one single number in a box is wrong, you can easily figure it out by looking at the intersecting rows and columns around it. By creating these complex spatial relationships directly in the data structure, they can spot physical errors much more easily. If a single bit is wrong or deleted, it breaks the mathematical pattern in the entire grid, not just in that one isolated line, making it much easier to correct.
They also talked heavily about AGS codes, which are specifically designed to handle those insertion and deletion errors you mentioned earlier, the indels. Because if you delete just one single bit in a normal computer file, everything after it shifts over by one space, and the entire rest of the file becomes complete gibberish.
Precisely. Conventional error correction often fails catastrophically if the data shifts alignment. HEDGUS anticipates that physical shift and uses a specialized algorithm to correct for it on the fly, realigning the data as it reads.
Okay, there is one more major hurdle in the active debate section that we need to cover, and this one is highly practical. Random access. Basically finding the needle in the haystack.
This is a huge, huge problem for the industry right now. Imagine you have a tiny test tube on your desk. In that single drop of liquid, you literally have a billion different DNA strands. Some of those strands make up the movie Shrek, some of them are the text of the U.S. Constitution, and some of them are just random photos of cats, and they are all just freely floating, completely mixed together in a clear soup.
And I just want my cat photo. I really don't want to waste time and money reading Shrek right now.
Exactly, but how do you actually get it? You can't just click on a folder icon. If you dump that whole tube into a sequencer and read everything, it costs an absolute fortune and takes days of processing time. You would have to chemically read a billion unwanted strands just to find the 10 specific strands that make up your cat photo.
So what's the workaround? How do they solve it?
You use something called PCR primers. Polymerase chain reaction. It's a very standard lab technique to amplify specific DNA. When you initially encode the digital file, you intentionally attach a specific, unique chemical barcode or address sequence to the very ends of the DNA strands for that specific file.
Oh, kind of like a digital file header or a metadata tag.
Exactly like that. So when you eventually want the cat photo back, you synthesize a tiny chemical primer that perfectly matches only that specific barcode. You drop it in the tube, and it acts like a target targeted chemical magnet. It physically finds only the cat photo strands floating in the soup and tells the enzymes in the tube to copy only those specific strands over and over again.
So you basically chemically search for the file, multiply it a billion times in a few hours, and then when you finally sequence a sample of that liquid, the cat photo makes up 99% of what the machine actually sees. The Shrek DNA is technically still floating in there, but it's just statistical background noise at that point.
Precisely. It allows for true random access in a totally unstructured liquid medium, but actually designing those chemical barcodes is mathematically very complex because you have to make absolutely sure they don't accidentally stick to each other or accidentally stick to a random part of the data itself and amplify the wrong thing.
It is just incredible to me that we are literally solving standard computer science file system problems using wet chemistry.
That is the true essence of this entire field. It is the complete convergence of wet lab biology and theoretical information theory.
Okay, let's pivot and move to part 3, the frontiers. Because this is the stuff in the research that might change absolutely everything. The stuff that makes current DNA storage look like, well, like old tech before it's even fully arrived.
I agree, the frontier stuff is wild. One of the most exciting developments right now is coming out of a team at Arizona State University, electronic DNA storage.
This one completely blew my mind when I read it, because up until now, we've been talking about DNA as strictly a chemical thing that you have to read with lasers or pull through a microscopic pore. But this team is talking about actually integrating it directly into a live circuit.
Yes, they are. The researchers there, led by Josh Hihath, basically decided to try and bypass the incredibly slow chemical synthesis and sequencing bottleneck entirely. They asked a really simple but profound question. Can we just make the DNA molecule itself conductive? So they created a solid-state chip where the DNA is literally wired in as part of the electrical circuit.
But how does that even work? I mean, DNA isn't copper wire. It doesn't naturally conduct electricity like that.
Not naturally, no. But they found a highly precise way to chemically insert loose metal ions, specifically silver and mercury ions, directly into the spaces between the DNA bases.
So they're essentially doping the DNA the way you dope silicon to make a microchip.
In a sense, yes. By changing the local pH of the solution or altering the voltage applied directly to the system, they can actively force these metal ions to either bind tightly to the DNA or release and float away. When the metal ion is bound tightly between the biological bases, the overall electrical resistance of that entire DNA strand fundamentally changes. It conducts an electrical current completely differently.
So they are creating distinct physical states. It acts just like a physical switch in a computer.
Exactly. And because of the chemistry involved, they actually created reversible states representing a +1, a 0, and a -1.
Wait, so it's not even binary at that point. It's basically trinary.
Effectively, yes. But the truly revolutionary key here is that it gives you electronic read and write capability. You don't need to slowly chemically synthesize a brand new molecule to write a bit of data. You just quickly apply a tiny voltage and the metal ion snaps into place. You wrote the data. And you don't need a massive expensive sequencer to read it later. You just measure the electrical resistance across the strand in microseconds.
That sounds vastly faster than what we were talking about with the inkjets and test tubes.
Ideally, yes, magnitudes faster. It perfectly bridges the gap between the density of biology and the speed of standard solid-state electronics. It could eventually allow for something that looks exactly like a standard USB memory stick that you just plug into your laptop, rather than a glass capsule of fluid you have to mail off to a specialized genomics lab. It brings the read and write speeds much closer to what consumers expect from modern electronics, while still keeping that insane molecular density.
That is just a complete game changer. And then there's the research from Brown University. They basically looked at DNA and said, why stop at DNA? And they came up with metabolome storage.
The metabolic soups. This is brilliant out-of-the-box thinking.
You have to explain this to me.
Yeah.
Because when I hear the word metabolite, my brain immediately thinks of those brightly colored energy drinks or like daily multivitamins.
Well, that is exactly what they are. A metabolome is simply the total collection of all the small chemical molecules found within a biological sample. We're talking about simple sugars, amino acids, vitamins, just basic tiny chemical compounds. The team at Brown University, led by Jacob Rosenstein, realized that the mere presence or absence of these very common molecules in a mixture could perfectly act as digital bits.
So instead of carefully ordering A, C, G, T in a long chain, it's just asking, is there sugar in this drop? Yes or no. Is there vitamin C in this drop? Yes or no.
Exactly. Imagine a microscopic droplet of water on a plate. You have a predefined library of, say, 10 different common metabolites in your lab. If the droplet contains metabolite number 1, the computer reads that as a 1. If it doesn't contain it, it reads it as a 0. You can build up complex binary codes simply by mixing these incredibly cheap, off-the-shelf chemicals together in specific combinations.
And they actually encoded real images with this method. I saw some pictures in the notes.
They did. As a proof of concept, they successfully encoded a digital image of an ibex and, of course, a cat.
Of course they did a cat. I mean, the internet fundamentally demands it at this point.
Naturally, and the readout process for this is completely different from DNA. It's done using a machine called a mass spectrometer, which is a very common piece of lab equipment that basically weighs individual molecules extremely precisely. It essentially tastes the microscopic droplet and spits out a list of exactly what molecular ingredients are floating in the soup.
But why go through the trouble of doing this instead of just sticking with DNA? Is it fundamentally better in some way?
Well, these metabolite molecules are physically much, much smaller than DNA. DNA is a very long, very heavy, complex polymer chain. Metabolites are just tiny individual compounds, so theoretically the volumetric density could eventually be even higher than DNA, and it might ultimately be vastly cheaper because you are using incredibly common bulk chemicals like basic sugars and amino acids, rather than painstakingly synthesizing complex, bespoke genetic sequences base by base.
It honestly sounds like you're just cooking data. Like, I'll take a tiny pinch of fructose, a dash of lysine, and a drop of vitamin B, and that chemical recipe perfectly spells out the word hello.
In a very real way, yes. It completely opens up the radical idea of molecular data storage beyond just nucleic acids. It strongly suggests we can store massive amounts of digital data in almost any stable chemical mixture, provided we have machines that can read the chemical signature back accurately.
And then there's DNA computing. This ties back into Catalog's long-term vision, right? The company with the big Shannon printer.
Yes.
Yeah.
Catalog and several other ambitious labs aren't just trying to statically store the data like a hard drive. They actually want to use the unique properties of the DNA to actively process the data.
Processing right inside the tube.
Think about the current bottleneck. If you have a truly massive exabyte-scale database stored in DNA and you want to search it to find a specific pattern, currently you have to sequence the whole thing, turn it entirely back into digital binary code, load it onto a massive silicon server farm, and then finally search it. It's incredibly inefficient.
Right, moving the data back and forth is the real bottleneck in computing.
But we know that DNA naturally interacts with other DNA. We know this from basic biology. Strands bind to complementary strands. So you can intentionally design specialized biological enzymes or chemical probes that physically perform standard computer logic operations like AND or R and not T gates completely chemically. You can literally search through massive unstructured data sets in parallel because every single molecule floating in that tube is effectively being chemically tested at the exact same time.
So the test tube itself actually becomes the CPU.
In a sense, yes. It allows for unbelievable, massive parallelism. A high-end silicon chip processes instructions sequentially, or maybe across a few dozen cores if you have a great processor. A single test tube has trillions of individual biological processors, the molecules themselves, all working and reacting simultaneously. It could completely revolutionize how we do pattern matching or search through massive unstructured data sets like global weather patterns or financial markets.
Speaking of alternative ways to do all this, we should probably briefly mention the Superman crystals. I saw this buried in the notes and it sounded too cool to skip.
Yes. The 5D optical storage in glass. This is frequently mentioned in the literature as the main theoretical competitor to DNA for long-term archiving. It involves using highly precise femtosecond lasers to physically etch microscopic nanostructures deep inside blocks of fused quartz glass. It is incredibly, almost absurdly durable. It could easily last for billions of years, and it can withstand extreme direct heat that would instantly vaporize DNA. It is a very strong rival for the Forever Archive title, but it entirely lacks the biological compatibility aspect of DNA. I mean, we aren't made of quartz glass. We are made of DNA.
Which actually brings us really nicely to part 4, the implications, because this is where the rubber meets the road. Why does all this incredibly dense science actually matter? We've got the tech, the active debates, the wild frontiers. What does this actually mean for us and for society as a whole over the next decade?
Let's start with the economics, because money always drives this. This is absolutely not just a cute benchtop science project anymore. It is a rapidly maturing global market.
Yeah, the financial projections are huge. One industry report we looked at mentioned a projected CKG A compound annual growth rate of over 50% for the sector? That's just massive compounding growth.
It is entirely driven by the desperate, exploding need for enterprise archival solutions. The immediate target sectors are pretty obvious. Healthcare is a massive one. We are currently sequencing millions and millions of people's individual genomes for personalized medicine. Where on earth do we securely store all that incredibly dense genomic data?
Storing human DNA data on synthetic DNA. That feels very, very meta.
It really does, but it is fundamentally the most logical place for it. Then you have government sectors, desperately needing solutions for national archives, tax records, intelligence data, and media and entertainment. Think about the big legacy movie studios. They have these incredibly valuable, irreplaceable master digital reels of films like Star Wars or The Godfather that they need to keep absolutely pristine forever. Physical digital hard drives fail constantly. Traditional celluloid film degrades and burns. DNA provides the ultimate permanent backup vault.
And I guess the overarching hope is that as these massive players jump in with their huge budgets, Hollywood, the Pentagon, the Library of Congress, the economies of scale kick in and the cost crashes down for the rest of us normal people.
That is the standard technology adoption curve we've seen time and time again, the Moore's law of DNA synthesis. The massive enterprise contracts fund the R&D to make the machines faster and cheaper until eventually it becomes completely viable for mid-sized businesses and maybe one day for everyday consumers.
Then there is the sustainability angle. We touched on this briefly earlier, but it is really worth hammering home. Traditional data centers are incredibly dirty.
They are absolute energy hogs. Data centers currently account for a really significant and growing percentage of total global electricity use. And a huge portion of that power isn't even used for computing, it's used purely for cooling. You have to pump in millions of gallons of water and run massive air conditioners just to keep the servers from melting themselves.
And with DNA.
Once you synthesize the molecule and seal it inside one of those glass or steel capsules, it just sits on a shelf at normal room temperature. Zero ongoing energy consumption. You could literally store the entire contents of the global internet in a space the size of a small coat closet, close the door, and turn off the lights. The ongoing carbon footprint of storing that data drops to absolute zero.
But actually creating it takes energy. Let's be fair about the whole life cycle.
It absolutely does. The physical synthesis process is highly energy intensive right now, especially the chemical methods. That is the major catch that critics rightfully point out. We really need the total life cycle to be sustainable, not just the storage phase. That is exactly why the industry's shift to enzymatic synthesis, the green synthesis we discussed, is so incredibly critical. If we can reliably make the DNA using natural biological enzymes in low-temperature water, rather than using heavy chemical heaters and toxic solvents, the massive carbon footprint of the initial creation phase drops dramatically.
Now let's talk about something slightly more philosophical, but equally important. The digital dark age.
Yes, this is a very serious concept coined by people like Vint Cerf, who is widely considered one of the founding fathers of the internet. The deep fear is that by digitizing absolutely everything, we are inadvertently creating a massive black hole in human history.
Because we just can't physically read the old media anymore as tech moves on.
Exactly. Andrew, think about it. Have you ever tried to find a working computer that can actually read a 5¼ inch floppy disk today?
I would even begin to know where to look. Maybe deep in the bowels of eBay.
Exactly, or an old zip drive from the late 90s. Proprietary file formats change constantly. Old WordPerfect documents from 30 years ago are surprisingly hard to open cleanly on a modern machine. Hardware inevitably becomes obsolete. In 500 years, will anyone alive even be able to interface with the standard USB stick? Maybe not. They might not even conceptually know what a USB port was designed to do.
But the argument goes, they will absolutely be able to read DNA.
Always. As long as the human race exists, or really any advanced biological intelligence exists, we will inherently have machines specifically designed to read DNA, because we will always need to read our own bodies. We will always need to diagnose complex cancers. We will always need to rapidly sequence and understand new viruses. The fundamental technology required to read DNA will always be completely relevant to our survival. Therefore, DNA data storage is effectively backwards compatible for eternity.
That is actually a really comforting thought, honestly, that our collective history, our art and science won't just vanish entirely because we accidentally lost the right dongle to plug into the wall.
There are amazing global projects already actively working on exactly this. The Memory of the World project run by UNESCO is exploring it. The Montreux Jazz Digital Project is currently preserving thousands of hours of irreplaceable live music concerts onto DNA right now.
And the Arch Mission Foundation. I found their stuff fascinating.
Oh, yes. Their goal is basically sending massive backup libraries of human knowledge out into space, literally putting a backup of Wikipedia on the moon. DNA is incredibly light, it is microscopically compact, and it is almost perfectly durable against the harsh environment of space. It is the absolute perfect medium for interstellar travel. If you seriously want to send the entire sum of human knowledge to a completely different star system, you obviously don't load a massive, heavy server rack onto a rocket. You send a single gram of dried DNA.
There's also this weirdly cool, almost cyberpunk application called biotagging mentioned in the economic reports.
Yes, this is where the technology bleeds directly into global supply chain management. You can theoretically synthesize a tiny, tiny amount of custom DNA and physically spray it directly onto a high-value product, like a barrel of high-end, extremely expensive olive oil, or a priceless painting, or even rough diamonds. That synthetic DNA sequence acts as an invisible molecular barcode that is mathematically impossible to fake.
So if I go to a fancy store and buy a terribly expensive bottle of imported olive oil, I can actually test it to see if it's the real deal.
Well, the manufacturer or customs agent can. They can quickly swab the bottle or sample the oil, run it through a portable sequencer, read the specific DNA tag, and perfectly trace the absolute provenance of that specific item all the way back to the exact farm or the exact factory batch it came from. It's an entirely unforgeable physical watermark at the molecular level.
And the biotagging goes even further. What about genetically modifying actual living plants with data?
Ah, the transgenic tombstone concept. There was a fascinating conceptual project proposing to take a deceased person's genetic DNA, or perhaps just a compressed text file containing their life story, and actually encode it directly into the living genome of a sapling, like an apple tree. So the physical tree itself becomes a living, breathing memorial. Every single biological cell in every single leaf growing on that tree contains a perfect copy of the digital data.
Or like the contemporary artist Eduardo Canusic, who famously encoded a message into his own DNA and then put it into the actual living veins of a petunia flower.
Yes, creating living connections between data and biology. That kind of work is very poetic, and it really pushes boundaries, but also leads us right into the final and perhaps most critical area, the ethics of all this.
It definitely does. There are some very serious biosecurity concerns here that we can't just gloss over.
We have to be completely realistic about the dual-use nature of this technology. If we eventually have highly capable machines that can easily print complex DNA sequences on demand just to store an Excel spreadsheet, what is physically stopping someone from using that exact same machine to print a deadly virus?
That is a genuinely terrifying thought. A desktop DNA printer in someone's garage that prints a functional strain of smallpox instead of a tax return.
That is known as the screening problem in the industry. Currently, the major commercial DNA synthesis companies like Twist heavily screen every single order that comes in. They run the requested sequence against a massive, constantly updated global database of known dangerous pathogens. If you try to order the sequence for the Ebola virus, massive red lights go off on their end, the order is immediately halted, and the FBI probably knocks on your door the next morning.
But if we start decentralizing this hardware, right, like giving everyone a small DNA printer for their own personal home data backups, we are going to need incredibly robust, unbreakable software protocols to ensure that hardware simply cannot be misused by bad actors.
Precisely. And then, on a slightly less apocalyptic but still annoying note, there's the biological spam problem.
Yeah, I honestly love this little detail in the research. Biological spam. It's almost funny until you think about it.
Well, if we do start casually writing digital data directly into the living genomes of reproducing bacteria, like that famous experiment where Harvard researchers successfully encoded a running GIF of a galloping horse into the DNA of living E. coli bacteria using CRISPR, are we basically just permanently polluting the natural gene pool with garbage data?
Right. If some shady marketing company decides to encode a digital commercial for a car insurance company into a hardy strain of bacteria, and they accidentally or intentionally release it, does that bacteria just keep multiplying and spreading in the wild? Do we end up with literal biological spam permanently floating around in the global ecosystem?
It is a totally valid and largely unanswered question, and it brings up intellectual property, too. Who actually owns the legal rights to that data once it's alive? If I formally store my proprietary corporate data inside a biological medium, How does existing legal precedent adapt to that? Who literally owns the biological internet? If a genetically modified bacteria containing your copyrighted data naturally reproduces in a puddle outside, do you legally own the offspring?
These are incredibly heavy, complex questions. But honestly, that is exactly why we do these kinds of explorations. It forces us all to think through the long-term consequences long before the consumer technology actually arrives on our desks.
Indeed, it does. We are currently living through the transition from the silicon age to the biotech age. The massive convergence of computation and biology is simply inevitable at this point.
It really fundamentally changes how you look at the world. You look at a tiny drop of water or a single green leaf on a tree, and it's not just basic biology anymore. It's pure, dense information.
It always has been information, honestly. We are just finally building the tools to learn how to read and write it ourselves.
Well, we have covered an absolutely massive amount of ground today. From the basic four-letter biological alphabet to that mind-bending 215 petabyte density limit. From the highly toxic chemical baths to the clean, green enzymes. From those massive kitchen-sized factory printers down to the microscopic electronic chips doping DNA with silver.
And crucially, the massive implications for preserving our human history, shifting our global economy, and hopefully saving our planet's energy grid. It is an incredibly dynamic field that is evolving rapidly month by month, and I strongly suspect if we sit down and revisit this exact topic in 5 years, the entire technological landscape will look completely different than what we discussed today.
Before we wrap up, thank you to all our partners, sponsors, and scholars who made this podcast and the research possible. We're truly grateful for your support.
And to our listeners, thank you for being part of this journey with us. We hope you enjoyed today's discussion. If you did, be sure to subscribe and support us in Patreon. And of course, you can write to us in comments if a specific topic needed to be covered, which help us all to grow.
Until next time, stay curious, keep learning, and let the search for wisdom guide you forward. Have a great day.